When Robin was a youth of 18, stout of sinew and bold of heart, the Sheriff of Nottingham proclaimed a shooting match and offered a prize of a buzz.
There's a moment of change that happens in millions of people's homes that almost nobody notices. A mother spends years reading to her child. I mean, at first it's board books, and then nursery rhymes, picture books, then Winnie the Pooh, then Charlotte's Web, then the Chronicles of Narnia, and somewhere along the way, that child learns how to read. And we celebrate, because that was the goal, wasn't it? Now he can read by himself. And so little by little, something changes. The bedtime chapters become less frequent. Mom stops sitting beside him with the book. The family read aloud slowly disappears, and then we start to say something absolutely reasonable. He can read by himself. But lately I've been wondering, why did we ever decide that learning to read meant that we should stop being read to? Because those are actually two different things. When a child reads independently, he's developing incredibly important skills: decoding, fluency, comprehension, reading stamina. All of those things matter. But when you read aloud to a child, something entirely different happens. You can hand him a language that is far more sophisticated than any language he would choose, or even be able to tackle comfortably on his own. And you can introduce him to stories that he might otherwise abandon after 3 pages. And you can stop in the middle of a paragraph and say, wait a minute, did you hear that? Or why do you think he did that? And suddenly you're no longer reading just a book. You're talking about courage and cowardice, loyalty, betrayal, sacrifice, justice, mercy, pride, friendship, human nature. And you didn't have to sit down and create a lesson plan called character development. The story did it for you. And there's something startling about the simplicity of all of this. You don't need a subscription. You don't need a curriculum. You don't need an app. You don't need an expensive tutoring program. You need a human voice, a child willing to listen, and a book between you. My name is Janae Daniels. I'm a wife, a mother of 6, and a former middle school teacher turned homeschool mom, independent researcher, and educational consultant. Welcome to the School to Homeschool podcast. Modern research has given us some very good reasons to take shared reading seriously, but history gives us another clue. Because for much of human history, books were not experienced only as one silent person sitting alone with a page. Words were spoken. Stories were heard. Poetry was recited. Scriptures were read aloud. Speeches were performed. Literature was shared. So today, I want to ask a very simple question. What have we lost by making reading such a solitary activity? And perhaps an even more important question, what might happen in our homes if we started reading aloud again and didn't just simply stop because our kids got older? When we think of reading today, we usually imagine somebody curled up on a couch with a blanket and a book. But reading hasn't always been considered just a solitary activity. For centuries, reading and listening were deeply, deeply entwined. There's this famous passage in Augustine's Confessions where he describes watching Bishop Ambrose read silently. He notices that his eyes are moving across the page, but he remains silent. Historians still debate today, like how much silent reading the ancient world would do. And I don't want to make a ridiculous claim to say that nobody in the ancient world ever read silently. Of course they could. But the fact that Augustine even thought that Ambrose's silent reading was worth mentioning tells us something really interesting. The relationship between the written word and the spoken word has changed over time. And we see this again much later. I want you to think about Charles Dickens. Today, we think of Charles Dickens as a novelist. But Dickens didn't simply write books, he performed them. In the 19th century, people paid money to sit in an audience and listen to Charles Dickens read his own stories aloud. He traveled with a specifically designed reading desk. He marked up performance copies of his books. He practiced voices. He performed characters. And audiences would sit there sometimes for hours listening to a man read from a book. Imagine saying, for date night, I bought us tickets to go listen to somebody read A Christmas Carol. And actually, I would love that, but my husband would poke his eyes out. Once we went and saw a play of Screwtape Letters, and there was just 2 characters in the play, and they essentially performed the book as 2 characters, and one of the characters was silent, and literally, I loved it, but my husband was like, this has been terrible, and I love you, which is why I came. So imagine Charles Dickens sitting there reading aloud, and people paid money to come and see it. The Victorian audiences loved it because literature wasn't understood as information only just sitting on a page. It had a voice, it had rhythm, it had emotion. It was meant to be heard. And we see something similar in education. For those of you new to my channel or new to my podcast, you may not know, but I collect vintage textbooks, specifically antique textbooks, so over 100 years old. And I actually use them to teach my own children. The beautiful thing, especially about the readers, is that many of the passages are meant for oral recitation, and they're meant to be read aloud. There's poetry, there's speeches and dialogues. Prime example of this are the McGuffey Readers. They weren't simply trying to teach children to recognize words. Children encountered poetry and stories and speeches and moral juicy questions. There was vocabulary, recitation, expression. Language was meant to be spoken as well as meant to be read. Older education understood something that I think that we have lost in modernity. Words weren't just supposed to be recognized by the eye. They were supposed to be heard, spoken, remembered, discussed, and shared. One of the most fascinating reasons to read aloud is actually very simple. Books talk differently than we do. Think about the language that you use with your children on a daily basis every single morning. Did you brush your teeth? Did you take out the trash? We have to leave in 5 minutes. Everybody get in the car, get your shoes on, put your plate in the sink, right? It's all very perfectly useful language. We tend to use the same words again and again and again, but books don't have that limitation. Researchers Jessica Montag, Michael Jones, and Linda Smith studied the language in 100 children's picture books and compared it with ordinary speech directed toward children. And they found that the books contained much greater lexical diversity. In other words, books exposed children to a wider variety of words than ordinary conversation did. Instead of hearing, look at that big dog, a child might hear, the enormous hound lumbered reluctantly toward the gate. Suddenly, you've got enormous, hound, lumbered, reluctantly. Words we may not casually use while loading the dishwasher. Books allow ordinary parents to place extraordinary language into the home. I love that because you don't have to personally speak like Charles Dickens. All you have to do is open Charles Dickens. You don't have to casually spend breakfast dropping words like peculiar, melancholy, treacherous, and gallant into conversation. A good book will do that for you. And children hear those words in context. That matters. Because vocabulary isn't just memorizing definitions from a list. It's hearing a word used properly in a sentence, understanding its tone, its purpose, its relationship to everything around it. And when children hear rich language again and again and again, guess what? It becomes normal. There was another fascinating study published in 2019 that became known for something researchers called the million-word gap. Now, I want to be careful because that phrase can sound more dramatic than the study actually was. This was a mathematical estimate. So what happened is the researchers counted the average number of words in children's books and then estimated how many book words children might encounter depending on how frequently they were read to. And they estimated that reading roughly one picture book per day could expose a child to around 78,000 book words in a year. And over several years, those numbers became enormous. Their model estimated that a child who regularly heard several books each day could enter kindergarten having encountered roughly 1.4 million more words from books than a child who was almost never read to. What? The important idea isn't that 1.4 million is somehow magical. The important information that is the accumulation. 10 minutes a night doesn't feel very important. One chapter doesn't feel very life-changing. One poem doesn't feel like it's big enough to alter an education. The power comes in the accumulation, right? That compound effect. One chapter, one poem, one conversation, one beautiful sentence, one unfamiliar word repeated again and again, day after day, year after year, and something that at one point looked really tiny becomes enormous. I think this is one of the things that we get wrong in education. Oftentimes we look for like the quick fix, like the big, like what curriculum is going to change everything overnight. We search for the big program, the revolutionary teaching method, the thing that's going to fix everything. And sometimes the thing that matters the most is the smallest thing. Small hinges that swing the big doors. It's that sit down, you open a book, you read for 10 minutes, and then you do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. Now let's talk for a second about what's happening when a child is actually listening. There's fascinating research that looks at what happens to a child's brain when they are actually, when a young child actually is listening to stories. Pediatric researcher Dr. John Hutton and his colleagues have used brain imaging to study preschool-aged children listening to stories. Some of that research has found associations between richer home reading environments and greater activation in brain regions involved in narrative comprehension and mental imagery. Again, I want to be careful. Association does not necessarily mean causation. I should never take one brain scan study and turn it into reading this book tonight will rewire your child's brain forever. That's not what the research proves. But it does support something that should be fairly intuitive. When you listen to a story without somebody providing every visual, your mind has work to do. If I show you Cinderella's castle on a screen, the castle has already been designed for you. Someone else has chosen the tower, the colors, the scenery, the landscape, the lighting. But if I tell you, at the edge of a dark forest stood an enormous abandoned house, your mind begins to construct it. How large is it? What color is it? Is the roof falling in? Is there fog? What does the door look like? Can you hear trees moving? Language requires us to create something internally. That doesn't mean that movies are evil. It doesn't mean that screens automatically destroy imagination. I mean, they can. But listening to something does something to the brain that is different than looking visually at a screen or a moving image. The mind participates. And that's one reason I think children need experiences where they're listening without pictures provided for them, especially moving ones. The secret power may not be the reading. And now we get to what I think is the most important part of the conversation. Because sometimes the most important part of the read aloud is actually what happens when you stop reading. You're halfway through a chapter, somebody says, "Wait, why did he do that?" And suddenly you're having a conversation that you could have never scheduled. You're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And you're talking about why Edmund would betray people who love him. You're reading Little Women, and you start talking about the pride of Joe and the heartbreak of Laurie. You're reading The Hobbit, and courage comes up. You're reading The Hiding Place. You're talking about forgiveness when somebody has done something very, very terrible. Reading history, and a child says, "Hey, that doesn't seem fair." And now you're discussing justice, and you're not using a worksheet. And you're not using a curriculum. There's no multiple choice question, no predetermined answer. The book opened the door. And this is something that stories do extraordinarily well. Stories allow children to study human nature at a very safe distance. They can talk about somebody else's greed before they talk about their own. Somebody else's cowardice, somebody else's bravery, somebody else's jealousy, somebody else's pride, somebody else's sacrifice. somebody else's courage. Stories give us a kind of laboratory into human behavior. We can ask, what happened? Was it right? What would you do? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of person do I want to become? That is not a small educational outcome. When we put children face to face with greatness, they see possibilities. I was reading The Courage of Sarah Noble with my daughter a couple years ago. And we read the story and she loved the story. And then she started a new enrichment program. And she came home that day and I said, how did it go? And she said, Mama, I was so scared because it was all new and I'm shy. But I just kept saying to myself, just like in the book, take courage, Sarah Noble, take courage. It was that book allowed her to experience courage through a window. She used that book to take courage herself. Shared reading is one part of a child's language environment. Children still need conversation. They still need independent reading. They need explicit reading instruction. I know some of y'all are like, yeah, but you're an unschooler. Yes, I am an eclectic unschooler, but the part that's eclectic with me is I don't believe that every child will or can learn to read just on their own. Someone like me had to have explicit instruction. And I think most children need explicit instruction. They need phonics. They need time. They need practice. They need knowledge. They need experience. The American Academy of Pediatrics has encouraged parents to share books with children beginning in infancy because of the connection with language literacy, cognitive development, social emotional development, and parent-child interaction. Most of the research focuses on young children. And that brings us to something that I find very interesting. Because almost everyone agrees that we need to read to a child, we need to read to the toddlers, we need to read to the preschooler, we need to read to the kindergartner. But somewhere after that, we seem to decide that the job is finished. And I keep coming back to the same question. Why? Let me be very clear. Reading aloud should never replace independent reading. Your child needs to read. They need to learn to decode words. They need to develop fluency. They need to learn reading stamina. They need to struggle through difficult passages. They need that experience of finishing a hard book and realize, I did that. I did that. Independent reading matters enormously, but this isn't an either or. I want you to think about it this way. When a child learns to play the piano, we don't say, well, now that you can play the piano, you are never going to listen to a great pianist ever again. When a child learns to cook, we don't say, well, now you know how to cook, nobody will ever cook for you again. Learning how to do something yourself does not eliminate the value of experiencing it with somebody else. I think this is especially important because there are some books that a child is intellectually ready to encounter, but their reading skill level may not be up to the challenge just yet. I want you to imagine handing a 9-year-old who is still an emerging reader Treasure Island. Maybe he or she reads 3 pages. The sentences feel unfamiliar. The vocabulary is challenging. The pace isn't what he or she is accustomed to. The language is difficult. He or she puts it down, and we conclude they're just not ready for it. But maybe he is. But maybe they're simply not ready to carry the mechanical burden of reading the book all by themselves. Now, imagine sitting beside that same boy or girl. You provide the pacing, you pronounce the unfamiliar words, you supply the voices, you give the sentences rhythm, and occasionally you stop and explain something. Suddenly, that same child may be completely absorbed in that story. Your voice has invited that child into the book that they might not have encountered by themselves. And eventually, he doesn't need that bridge anymore. That's exactly what we want. Reading aloud can take our children somewhere first, and then the independent reading can follow. So let's make this practical. What should you actually read? Here we go. For very young children around ages 2 to 5, read for rhythm, sound, repetition, beauty, delight. So think Mother Goose, Beatrix Potter, Winnie the Pooh, Aesop's Fables, beautiful picture books, fairy tales. And don't worry if they ask for the same book again and again and again and again and again and again and on repeat. Repetition is not failure. It's one of those ways that children absorb language, is that repetition. For roughly ages 5 to 8, you can begin stretching beyond what they might independently choose. So Charlotte's Web, My Father's Dragon, The Wind in the Willows, Heidi, Little House in the Big Woods, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Secret Garden, mythology, historical biographies, and please don't automatically eliminate picture books just because kids get older. Picture books are full of rich language, and even I enjoy them as adults, and I think most adults still enjoy beautifully written picture books. For children around 8 to 12, you can begin moving into increasingly serious literature, Treasure Island, Little Women, The Hobbit, Chronicles of Narnia, Around the World in 80 Days, Johnny Tremain, Carry On, Mr. Bowditch, biographies, historical narratives, and this is a wonderful age to begin reading small pieces from original historical resources. Now we get into the age where I think many families begin to stop, like 12, 13, 14. And I would encourage you, don't stop. Don't stop reading to them. A Christmas Carol, Sherlock Holmes, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Lord of the Rings, The Hiding Place, Jane Eyre, The Old Man and the Sea, Animal Farm, Shakespeare, great speeches, biographies, narrative histories. And let me say one other thing here. Children do not have to sit perfectly still with their hands folded while you're reading aloud to them, or even while you're listening to an audiobook. They can draw, they can knit, they can crochet, they can build something quietly, they can play with Legos, they can whittle, they can work on a puzzle. They could run around in a circle. Some of those boys need to get their energy out. That's perfectly fine. Sometimes that movement will help children listen. Listening doesn't always have to look like staring directly at the narrator. And with teenagers, I would stop thinking about it as like mom is reading to the children as opposed to our family reads together. Rotate readers. Maybe have dad read sometimes. Maybe have the teenager read occasionally. Read Shakespeare with everyone taking a character. That's another way you could approach it. Read Dickens, read Austen, read Twain, read Tolkien, read C.S. Lewis. Read great speeches. Read memoirs. Read scripture. Read historical documents. At that point, you've crossed into something much larger. You're no longer merely teaching reading. You're creating a shared intellectual life inside your family. Now, I had a friend who, when she was 16 years old, that's when I met her, and her dad read to them several times a week, and they would not miss it, and here he had all of these teenagers, and he was reading beautiful books to them, and they never wanted to miss it. And that was something I was a little envious of, because I was like, because my parents, I think my mom read to us a handful of times, maybe, but I was dumbfounded that my friend's father would read to them as teenagers, and at the same time, I thought it was beautiful as a 16, 17-year-old. So I also thought she was one of the smartest people I had ever met, and I realized they had this, as I mentioned, a shared intellectual family culture, which is pretty amazing. Before you go off and make a laminated reading program, don't do that. Please don't destroy reading aloud with your family and make it a chore and make it work. Don't turn every book into schoolwork. Don't stop at every paragraph and ask questions to see if they're listening. They are listening. Don't sit and ask every time what the author's purpose was. Sometimes just read the freaking book. If every beautiful book turns into an assignment, then you will kill the love of reading. Don't do that. Just enjoy the time as a family and read together. Second, quit occasionally while they still want more. If everyone says just one more chapter, okay, occasionally give them one more chapter. Leave them wanting more. Third, read above your child's normal reading level, but not completely, hopelessly above their reading level. Challenge is good, but 45 minutes of confusion is not. Fourth, you are allowed to abandon books. If you are not enjoying the book, you don't have to finish it. If the kids don't like it, you don't have to finish it. You can put it away and choose something else. Fifth, choose books that you enjoy too. Children can tell when you hate the book. And frankly, you are much more likely to want to keep reading if you're enjoying it yourself. Number 6, use voices if you enjoy doing voices. I, for one, do. But you don't have to become a professional actor. Frankly, your children need your voice more than they need an audiobook narrator. But if you do get tired reading, the audiobook is always an option. And finally, Start embarrassingly small. 5 minutes, a chapter, half a chapter. Breakfast, you could read at lunch, you could read right before bedtime. You don't need a Victorian drawing room. You don't need matching pajamas. You don't need candles and classical music, although sometimes it helps. Just open the book and begin. One day, you will read your last bedtime story to your last child. And the strange thing is, you probably won't realize it's the last one. There won't be an announcement. Nobody will say, tonight marks the end of an era. You'll simply close the book, and life will move forward. Children will grow, and schedules will change. Bedrooms move farther apart, and somehow, something that once happened every night will become something that you used to do. And that's why I think we should be very careful about ending this tradition, because we feel like a child is just too old to be read to. Because perhaps the question never was, can he read it himself? Of course he can. Maybe the better question is, what happens when we experience this book together? Years from now, your children will not remember every worksheet that was assigned to them. They won't remember every vocabulary list. They may not remember when they learned long division, but they will remember that book that made them laugh so hard that none of you could keep reading. They may remember begging for one more chapter. They may remember realizing that halfway through the story that Dad was crying and pretending he wasn't. They may remember that character that everyone hated, the ending that nobody saw coming, that debate at the dinner table when you argue whether or not the person did the right thing. They may remember phrases from the books that became family jokes, characters who almost became family members, places that none of you ever visited except together. And perhaps one of the most extraordinary things that books can do, they allow somebody who lived hundreds of years ago, thousands of miles away, perhaps someone who has been dead for generations, to speak again. But when we read those words out loud, something else happens. We don't encounter that voice alone. We encounter it together. So yes, teach your children to read. Teach them to read well. Give them difficult books. Give them quiet. Give them time to read independently. But don't assume that independence means an end of being read to. Tonight, take a book off the shelf. Call everyone into the room. Open it. And read. Because you may be doing something far bigger than ending a chapter. You may be building part of your family's memory.